Late in the evening of 23 January, a column of vehicles of the 6th Mechanized Corps headquarters stopped in a small village which had recently been occupied by units of the 17th Guards Brigade. Now the tankers were fighting somewhere ahead, about 4 kilometers from the village. Shots were heard from the other side. Multicolored flares were flying into the dark sky now and then. We got out of the car. "Let's go to the commander," suggested the head of the political department of the corps, Colonel G. Potapov. "We need to get acquainted with the situation. Maybe there is some news." In the darkness we not without difficulty found the headquarters bus. Colonel V.F. Oryuv, without waiting for our questions. "We will not linger here for long." The commander ordered to force the Oder and seize the bridgehead. "What do you hear about our advanced detachment?" Potapov asked. "The detachment has already approached the Oder, but the river is not frozen yet, and there are no crossings. The Germans are going to firmly hold the western bank." Colonel Koretsky, Chief of Staff, came up. "Or Vasily Fedorovich," he turned to the corps commander. "We have received an instruction from the Stavka, especially distinguished at the forcing of the Oder, to be presented to the title of Hero of the Soviet Union." "Very good." Grigory Ivanovich, Mikamko turned to Potapov. "We take measures to make sure that this instruction was immediately known in all units." "It will be done, Vasily Fedorovich." Potapov replied. "Let's go, Nukog, we must get to work." In the car of the political department, we were waiting for Potapov's deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Zakalyukin, the same Zakalyukin whom I replaced in November 1943 as head of the original instructors department. After a quick snack, we discussed the tasks of the political department and decided to leave for the units at dawn. Major Lozovoy was going to go to the 16th Mech Brigade, and I with Zakalyukin, to the advanced detachment of the corps to the 17th Mech Brigade. It was quite dawn when we approached the Oder. The morning was frosty, but in the coastal forest tankers were working, having thrown off their overcoats. They felled trees, built rafts, repaired fishing boats. The sappers were bringing up the standard crossing equipment. From time to time, German shells flew into the forest, bursting with a heavy rumble. Then people fell into the snow, sheltering from splinters, then rose and again took up axes and saws. In a group of soldiers assembling the raft, I saw the head of the political department of the brigade, Lieutenant N.G. Gordeev. He, along with everyone else, was deftly wielding an axe. "Hello and a bow to the guards," I said. "How are you, Nikolai Grigorievich?" "Working hard, Comrade Chief." Gordeev stuck the axe into the log, wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his palm. "We were counting on bridges and crossings, but the fascists showed us their tail, swung over to the other side, and now they are spitting up. Do you hear? It's flying again." We fell into a snowdrift. A shell exploded nearby. The fragments shrieked and hit the trees. "Where is the brigade commander?" "Getting up?" asked Zakalyukin. "He's on the shore with the scouts." Gordeev shook off the snow from his overalls. "We have a small group crossed the Oder at night, clung there and is holding on. Now the brigade commander is thinking about how to use this bridgehead." "Shall we go to him?" I suggested it. "Well, let's go. Wait a minute, I'll put on my coat." The three of us went to the edge of the forest and through the dense, snow-covered shrubbery began to make our way to the shore. Closer to the water the shrubbery thinned. Here and there we could see camouflage guns and mortars, which were supposed to cover the crossing. Lieutenant Colonel Churilov was at the observation post, in a cramped dugout, above which the white-painted horns of a stereo telescope peered out cautiously. The brigade commander was staring intently into the eyepieces. He was so absorbed in this that he did not immediately notice our arrival. The frost was getting stronger. The river was drifting, a harbinger of ice formation. A thin crust of ice was already stretching along the banks. "Lousy river," said Churilov, finally breaking away from the telescope and greeting us. "It freezes in the middle of winter. Then it opens up a few more times, winter ice drifts and floods begin. In general, the river is restless, and it is not so easy to overcome it from the start. But we will overcome it anyway, damn it." "Leonid Dmitrievich," I turned to the lieutenant colonel. "You probably heard about the order of the Stavka? It's about the presentation to the title of hero. Of course I've heard. I've got candidates. We've already captured the bridgehead, and yesterday our scouts crossed to the other side. Sergeant Vilsky was in charge, Vyamin Vladimirovich. a fighting gun. Lieutenant Colonel Churilov said that yesterday morning, when it was dark, 5 scouts led by Sergeant Vilsky on a boat crossed to the west bank of the Oder to clarify the location of enemy firing points near the town of Keben. During the crossing, 2 were wounded and went back. The rest crawled between enemy pillboxes and found out that not all of them had garrisons. The scouts also found out that on the outskirts of the city stone houses are adapted for defence, with soldiers in them. On the way back, Sergeant Vilsky decided to make a daring attack on one of the pillboxes. The scouts attacked suddenly, killed 6 Nazis and 5 were captured. It was beginning to dawn. It was time to cross to the eastern shore, but the boat that was supposed to come for them was late. The whole day the scouts had to sit in the captured enemy pillbox, fighting off the Hitlerites. In the evening the boat finally arrived, and the scouts returned safely. 30 prisoners, which they delivered, gave important testimony about the number of the garrison of Keben and the system of defence of the western bank of the Oder. "That's what we have, brave guardsmen," proudly said Churilov. "We, of course, informed everyone about their feat. Here political workers tried. Returning from NP to the brigade units, we saw how more and more units were being pulled up. Tankers and self-propelled gunners moved out to the coastal groves. Artillery came closer, sappers were marking places for launching pontoons. On this day in companies and batteries, there were party and komsomol meetings, and before evening in many units there were short rallies. Night came frosty and clear. Cold vapour was billowing over the black water. Hitlerites, apparently, noticed our preparations for forcing an intensified artillery fire on the eastern bank and adjacent forests. Soldiers under fire hastily dragged boats, rafts, bundles of logs to the water. The first to cross were volunteers. Commanders and political workers made sure that in each boat there were communists and komsomol members. Here, breaking the ice edge, the first boat left. In it, Guardsman Communist Junior Lieutenant Sharapanov, machine gunners Communist Sidyakin and Komsomolets Koranov, machine gunners Pishchuk and Smolin. The soldiers amicably piled on the oars, and the boat swiftly, a little obliquely, began to cross the river, over which from shell bursts now and then rose fountains. On reaching the western bank, the brave men threw themselves into the dark shrubbery, lay down and opened fire. Overcoats and half-coats, wet during the crossing, froze, but nobody noticed the cold. Hitlerites fiercely counterattacked, trying to throw the guardsmen into the river. In Sharapanov's group all were wounded, but continued to fight. A little to the right on a landing boat crossed 13 people led by the commander of the sapper platoon, Communist Lieutenant Lukishev. The group stormed 4 pillboxes, destroying their garrisons, and held them for several hours until reinforcements arrived. Filipov, a soldier of the sapper battalion, was driving the landing boat back to the eastern bank. In the middle of the river, a close explosion of a shell overturned. Filipov swam to the shore, took part in the ferrying of the second group of fighters, and was wounded in the shoulder. Overcoming the pain, he still brought the second boat to the western shore and returned on it. There were many such examples of heroism of communists and komsomol members when forcing the Oder. While on the right flank, they were crossing the river on rafts and boats. On the left flank, sappers of the 49th Engineering and Pontoon Brigade were building a ferry crossing. Lieutenant Nazarenko took the rope for the ferry to the western bank. A mine hit the boat. 3 soldiers were killed. Nazarenko miraculously survived, but found himself in icy water. Without throwing the rope, the officer swam towards the western shore. Soon the ferry began to operate. The enemy was firing heavily on the area of the crossing. His aviation, which had not previously been very active, tried to prevent the forcing by airstrikes. Squadrons of enemy aircraft, changing one after another, now and then appeared over the Oder. Our anti-aircraft gunners drove away the enemy, but some planes managed to break through and hurriedly dropped bombs. For some time the ferry crossing was put out of operation. In the evening of 25 January, sappers put a pontoon bridge. On the west bank rushed the main forces of the 17th and 16th Mechanized Brigades. By morning the town of Keben was cleared of the enemy. The bridgehead behind the Oder was expanding. Comrades told me how the forcing of the Oder took place in the area of Stainau, on the site of the 10th Guards Ural Volunteer Tank Corps. Here it happened differently. On 24 January, 5 tanks of the 62nd Tank Brigade broke through the bridge over the Oder into the town of Stainau. But the success of the advanced detachment was not supported by the main forces of the brigade. The machine gunners on the tanks failed to cut the wires leading to the mines, and the Nazis managed to blow up one of the bridge spans. At night, the Uralians made another attempt to force the Oder over the bridge, having covered the blown-up span with boards. However, this attempt also failed. Then the corps commander decided to cross the river 3 kilometers south of Steino. Here there was an ice jam. The frost altered the ice flows, and people could cross them to the opposite bank, although there were numerous holes in the river. The first to step onto the ice were the riflemen of the 1st Battalion of the 29th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. The battalion commander, Guards Major Dotsopsev, made sure that each soldier had a board to cross the cracks and holes. Under the cover of fire from an artillery division and a mortar company, Dozotsev's battalion forced the Oder in 4 groups, seized the coastal pillboxes, and ensured the crossing of the rest of the brigade's units and subdivisions. By 9 a.m., on 25 January south of Steino, a bridgehead up to 4 kilometers wide and 2.5 kilometers deep had been created. Soon units of the 13th Army crossed here and significantly expanded the bridgehead. The last major water frontier on the way to Berlin was overcome. 2. On 30 January, I returned to the political department of the Army. Bridges had already been built across the Oder, reliably covered by anti-aircraft artillery. On them, on the western bank of the uninterrupted stream, went tanks, artillery, rear units. Almost all Politotdelts were gathered. They shared their impressions, argued, made predictions about the further development of the offensive. Nikolai Grigorievich Kladovoy came, listened, shook his head. I see that you have forgotten about our agreement. We were going to celebrate our entry into the enemy's land. Nakorg, I give you 30 minutes to prepare this event. We set the table ahead of schedule. There was no shortage of snacks and drinks. Comrades brought various appetizing things from the units. Tech proposed to start by trying French cognac. You, said Ivan Mikhailovich Yelagin. I got a bottle. I wanted to save it, but for such an occasion, I don't mind. We can have French, agreed Kladovoy. Ivan Mikhailovich took out of his duffel bag a rather large bottle with a bright label, unscrewed the tight glass stopper, and poured the golden liquid into glasses. At once a fine odour of perfume spread through the room. Nikolai Grigorievich took the glass, sniffed suspiciously. Wow, it smells like a hairdresser's shop. What does it taste like? So this is French cognac. Said Yelagin, emphasizing the word French. They, the French, have everything so fragrant. No, Ivan Mikhailovich, I don't like your French potion. Give me the bottle. The label said L'eau de Cologne. That's Cologne. The storekeeper could hardly speak for laughing. Well, my father-in-law, I see that you are a great connoisseur of foreign wines. Ivan Mikhailovich shoved the unfortunate bottle into a corner somewhere to the laughter of all present. The glasses had to be thoroughly washed. The odour of Cologne was persistent. When the laughter subsided, Kladovoy said quite seriously, "Well, keep quiet about this case. God forbid that anyone should find out you'd be laughed at." We filled our glasses again, this time with good wine. Nikolai Grigorievich stood up. "Hey, to our near victory, comrades." The dinner passed very cheerfully. By the 3rd of February, the 4th Tank Army was withdrawn to the 2nd echelon of the front. Brigades were putting themselves in order, replenished with fuel and ammunition. At a meeting of the Military Council with the presence of commanders of formations, chiefs of staff and deputies on political part of the Army commander, conducted a review of the operation to force the Oder. So 20 days of fighting Army troops occupied dozens of cities. Hundreds of settlements inflicted significant losses to the enemy in manpower and equipment. The commander noted the high combat skill of the personnel, the ability of tankers and motorized riflemen to attack at night. He also pointed out the mistake of the commander of the 62nd Tank Brigade, who was unable to use the success of the advance detachment, which captured the bridge near the town of Steino. The political department of the Army also summarized some of the results. The experience of battles showed what a huge role played by company party organizations, how great their influence. Therefore, we tried to preserve them through the correct placement of party forces, and most importantly, through the admission of the best officers, sergeants and soldiers into the party. People were drawn to the party. The party organizations received a continuous stream of applications. Only for January 1945 in the Army units were accepted as candidates for party membership 570 and as party members 354 people. A week later, the Army troops again went on the offensive. We had the task, together with the units of the 13th Army, to break through the enemy defence and to advance in the direction to Zagan, together with Major Lozow. I again went to the 6th Guards Mech Corps, which was engaged in fierce fighting for the crossing of the Biber River. On 12 February, some corps units forced the Boba and captured a bridgehead. In the last days, it got warmer. It was drizzling fine rain. But despite the low clouds, fascist planes appeared at the crossings, trying to break the pontoon bridges. We arrived at the village of Niedergrapi, 23 kilometres west of Frennestate. At the crossing, as is often the case, cars piled up. We were in the tail of a convoy. In about 5 minutes, we heard alarming, warning shouts. We heard the barking of anti-aircraft guns, and then the rumble of close bursts. Ryozavoy jumped out of the car, and I stayed in my place on the front seat. On the roof of the cabin, clods of earth banged. The glass flew out with a clinking sound. I pressed my face against the back of the seat, involuntarily squeezing my eyes shut. Finally, the bomb burst subsided. Shots of anti-aircraft guns fell silent. Enemy planes were driven away. Only the moans of the wounded were heard. There were 15 of them. 5 were killed. Lieutenant Colonel Chatelev, commander of the Communications Battalion, was lying next to our car. His face was quickly covered with deadly pallor. Blood was gushing from his leg. He carried away the wounded, as again the anti-aircraft guns rang. Fascist planes were again approaching the crossing. This time we hurried to take shelter in the basement of a stone house. Only after 2 hours Lozow and I crossed to the left bank of the Beaver and caught up with the motorized rifle units of the corps that had gone ahead. By the 14th of February, the 4th Panzer Corps captured the towns of Garci and Zoro. The main forces reached the Neus Riviera and in some places forced it. However, the rifle formations of the 13th Army lagged behind. Taking advantage of this, the enemy closed the gap in front of the bridgehead on the west bank of the Beaver and cut our communications. Created a rather difficult situation. In the 6th Guards Mech Corps arrived Colonel Kladovoy. Having talked to Orlov and Potapov, Nikolai Grigorievich offered me to go with him to one of the tank brigades. On the outskirts of some settlement we saw tanks standing close to the houses. In the middle of the street, the tankers were crowded together, surrounded by a dense, broad-shouldered man in overalls. When we came closer, we recognized the army commander, Colonel General Leyushenko. "Who told you that we were surrounded?" Angry asked the commander of the tankers. "And even if we are, fighting in an encirclement is a normal kind of battle. We should not look back, but look forward, break through to the rear of the enemy, smash him without mercy. This is not the 41st. The general took off his cap, scratched his bald head, and repeated, "We must look forward. The 13th Army is coming behind us. We have nothing to fear from encirclement." Noticing Kladovoy, Leyushenko called him over. "Have you heard, Commander-in-Chief? What are the moods of the tankers? They're afraid of encirclement. And this at the very end of the war. We are nothing, Comrade Commander. We heard protesting voices. We only asked to find out the situation. All right. I believe you. Is there enough fuel?" "Yes, Comrade Commander." "What about ammunition?" "Recently replenished." "Good." The commander approached the car, easily threw his leg over the side of the Willis. Immediately the car rushed forward. "Let's go to the Nisses, to the crossing," shouted the general to us. We could hardly keep up with the commander's car. He liked fast driving. There was a traffic jam at the crossing. In the middle of the pontoon bridge, a lorry with ammunition stopped its engine. Around him fussed soldiers, arguing, swearing. Somewhere nearby there was a battle. The crackle of machine guns could be clearly heard. Shells and mines reached the river, where the current carried stunned fish. Cars and tanks were pulling up to the crossing, and the unfortunate traffic jam was not dissolved. If even a few enemy planes appeared here, they could do such a thing. General Leyushenko was already on the bridge. Take it at once," he ordered loudly. "Friendlier. The general himself propped up the back of the stopped lorry with his shoulder. 1, 2. With noise and swearing, the heavily laden truck was rolled along the bridge to the opposite bank. Kladov and I arrived just as the truck was pushed off the bridge and onto the roadside. Stay here. Yes, the commander told me. See to it that there is order at the crossing. Do not allow traffic jams and crowds. Yes, Comrade General. Yes, when come to the 62nd tank, Kladovoy threw, hurrying to get into the car. The commander's Willies was already rushing along the shore. I spent several hours at the crossing. Gradually, the accumulation of tanks, artillery and vehicles decreased. Columns now did not stretch in a continuous string, and soon the bridge was completely empty. Having decided that my task was completed, I stopped a semi-truck of the 63rd Tank Brigade and climbed into the back. I knew that the 62nd and 63rd Brigades were operating side by side. We drove into a neat German forest. Here fresh tracks of tank tracks stretched from the road to the left. Let's go to the left, he said to the driver. The semi-truck jumped over the roots of trees. After a kilometre we saw that, judging by the tracks, the tanks had turned into battle order. Where to now? Asked the driver. Let's try straight ahead. But no sooner had we passed 200 metres than a machine gunner ran out of the bushes, waving his arms. Stop, stop! You're going to hell. You want to visit the Krauts? He shouted. The chauffeur braked sharply, leaned out of the cab. Why are you shouting? No, turn back. We can't go any further. Do you hear the battle going on? I jumped out of the truck, went to the soldier, and learnt from him that one of the units of the 62nd Brigade was fighting with the enemy. Where is the brigade headquarters? It's not far. It won't be a kilometre. You see that pointer on the tree over there? Follow the caterpillar tracks there. You'll find the brigade headquarters. Hey, fellow countryman, can you tell me anything about the 63rd Brigade? Where is it? Asked the driver. The machine gunner shook his head. I says, I don't know about the 63rd. I haven't met it. We were the first to come here. Apparently, the main forces of the 10th Corps went to the right. Drive back to the fork and take the right road, I advised the driver. I managed to find the brigade headquarters without difficulty. I met the brigade commander, Colonel Sergei Alexeyevich Denisov, and the head of the political department, Lieutenant Colonel Evgeny Mikhailovich Ilufiev. What are you doing here at this time of night? Surprised Ilufiev. I explained my unexpected appearance and in turn asked, Did you decide to have a rest? What rest is there? Frowned Colonel Denisov. We encountered enemy resistance. They are snapping at us, scoundrels, in a big way. We have already lost 2 tanks. Now I want to feel where it is better to strike. It was getting dark fast in the forest. The battle ahead was subsiding. Machine gun and machine gun bursts sounded less and less. Is there no one from the political department of the army? I turned to Ilufiev. Of course there is. Your propagandist has been staying with us for a few days. I've forgotten his surname. Major Livanov. That's him. Where is he? Talking to the crews. He's a brave guy, but a weirdo. He wants to be on the armour with the machine gunners, but he won't get into the tank. Ilufiev and I walked through the forest, lighting the way with pocket torches, so as not to come across trees and well-camouflaged tanks in the darkness. We talked to the tankers and machine gunners, gave them the content of Sovinform Bureau reports, asked whether they were provided with everything, how was the situation with food. In the morning, one of the tank companies moved to the edge of the forest. The company commander was tasked to carry out a reconnaissance by combat and identify the number of the enemy in the village, which was 3 kilometres from the forest. Passing to the cars. Start, sounded the command. The engines roared. Blue smoke burst out of the exhaust pipes of the tanks. The gunners clung to the turrets. And suddenly, I saw the lanky figure of Major Livanov. He and the machine gunners were on the armour. Livanov, where are you going? Stay here. I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the roar of the engines. The company successfully conducted a reconnaissance battle. When the tanks returned, I met Livanov. Why the hell did you go on a reconnaissance, and even together with the paratroopers? I asked the major. He shrugged his shoulders. What was I to do? I'm with this company all the time. How do you think I should have done? The company, into battle, and I in the bushes. Subsequently, Major Livanov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his participation in the daring reconnaissance. The 62nd Tank Brigade went forward again. The distance to Berlin was shrinking with every hour. 3. On one of the March days I went on official business to the 61st Guards Tank Brigade, the headquarters of which stood in the small town of Boleslavek. At that time there was a relative calm at the front. After the long battles, the army troops for a fortnight put themselves in order, preparing for a new offensive. Staff and political department of the brigade were engaged in everyday current affairs. There was not that tense situation which characterizes the staff work in the period of battles. Therefore I had an opportunity not only to fulfill the task but also to see the town. Boleslavek itself was not very interesting. An ordinary provincial town with a medieval town hall, not wide streets squeezed between rows of monotonous stone houses. But I, like any Russian person, was interested in the town because here, far from his homeland, in 1813 died Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov. Pursuing the defeated army of Napoleon, Russian troops under his leadership reached Boleslavets. Here Kutuzov became seriously ill and died on 28 April 1813. His body was taken to St. Petersburg and buried in the Kazan Cathedral, and his heart was buried a few kilometers from Boleslavets, on the Saxon Road, which moved on to Berlin and Paris Russian troops. This would symbolize that his Heart-Field Marshal remained with the soldiers. A modest monument in the form of a column on a granite pedestal was erected at the place of burial of Kutuzov's heart. There is a stone fence around the monument. By the way, after the war, a very beautiful cemetery of Soviet soldiers who fell in battles with Nazi invaders was arranged here. The cemetery is decorated with 2 tall obelisks. Between the rows of graves there are neat paths. In summer there are a lot of flowers. Workers of Boleslavik and surrounding Polish towns and villages piously honor the memory of Soviet soldiers. But, I repeat, the monuments and plates on the mass graves were installed after the war. And then, in March 1945, I saw only a modest obelisk erected more than 100 years ago in memory of an outstanding Russian commander. Another obelisk in memory of Kutuzov was erected in the city itself. Commander Kutuzov brought the victorious Russian troops to this place, but here death put a limit to his glorious deeds. He saved his fatherland and opened the ways of liberation of Europe. May the memory of the hero be blessed. I also visited the house where Kutuzov died. Now it is a museum, where the atmosphere of the last days of the commander's life is recreated. When our advanced units entered Boleslavets, they found an old memorial plaque on a small 2-story house with a mezzanine, smeared with lime, where it was stated that M.I. Kutuzov here. In the house itself nothing reminded of the great Russian commander. In the rooms were scattered things belonging to some burgher who hurriedly fled to the west. Kutuzov died. A little later, by order of the commandant of the town, the house was repaired, the rooms were put in order, and literature about Field Marshal was spread on the tables. This historic house was known to all soldiers and officers of the units passing through the city. All considered it their duty to look there. On the 8th of March, the front commander ordered the 4th Tank Army to redeploy to the area of Orlau, Lugwitz, and prepare for participation in the Opel offensive operation. The army used several days before the offensive for combat training. Measures were taken to protect the tanks from Faust's patrons. Shields of 60 TMI iron were installed on the vehicles. They covered the most vulnerable places of the tanks, forcing the cumulative mine to work prematurely in case of a hit. A specially issued leaflet explained how paratroopers should fight the enemy armed with Faust patrons. The offensive began on 15 March after a 2-hour artillery preparation. Battles were fought in the open area, in the forests between the Oder and Neisse rivers. Connections of the 6th Guards Mechanized Corps constrained the enemy, and meanwhile tankers broke through into the enemy rear and by the evening of March 17 came to the western bank of the Neisse. Hitlerites, caught in the cauldron, made every effort to leave to the west, but only a few succeeded. In the course of battles we learnt that our army was given the name of the Guards Army. The news about it quickly became known to all soldiers and officers and inspired them to new feats. The complete defeat of the Opernaya grouping was carried out in 5 days, and again native Moscow celebrated our victory with 20 artillery salvos. In the battles near Opelnoye on 18 March died the commander of the 6th Guards Mechanized Corps, hero of the Soviet Union, Colonel Vasily Fedorovich Orlov. I often met with him, saw him in the tense moments of the battle at the NP in the headquarters dugouts. Somehow it was hard to imagine that Vasily Fedorovitch was not alive, that I would never have to hear his familiar, confident voice again. The news of Vasily Fedorovitch's death reached his mother Maria Iosifovna. A simple Russian woman who had lost her second son in the war used her savings to buy a T-34 tank and asked to transfer it to the 6th Mech Corps. At the end of March, this tank was received. It was given the name Mother Motherland. At the same time, the Military Council of the Army received a letter from M.I. Orlova, "Accept from me, an old Russian woman, as a gift a combat vehicle T-34, it said. Give it to the best crew, and let it mercilessly smash the enemy. The Army Commander Colonel General D.D. Lelushenko handed the tank to the crew of Komsomol Junior Lieutenant Pyotr Kashnikov. The tankers swore to honourably fulfill the order of the mother of their dead commander, and they kept their word, Mkai. Our tanks were rushing towards Berlin. We went forward on empty fields, on roads broken by countless tracks and wheels. In the villages and small towns that met on our way, from the windows of houses hung white flags. Everywhere we could see ruins, heaps of broken bricks and traces of fires. And people freed from fascist captivity were moving towards us. They waved to the tankers and machine gunners sitting on the armour of combat vehicles, and the tired soldiers smiled back. The army troops moved day and night. The commander of the Front Marshal of the Soviet Union, S. Konev, set a task for the army to break into the southern outskirts of Berlin. For this purpose, it was necessary to pass with fights more than 200 kilometers from the initial positions on the Neisse River. We fulfilled the task in 10 days. Great was the offensive impulse that possessed the tankers. For 4 years, we lived with the idea to finish the war by defeating the enemy in his capital. In the hard summer of 1941, fighting near Brest and Bialystok, we firmly believed that the day would come when our tanks would pass through Berlin. Now the dream was coming true. How could the enemy, who resisted with the tenacity of a doomed man, hold us back? In those days, one could often see a poster on the front roads. A young soldier changed his shoes and clapped his hand on the shins of his boots. Say, we will reach Berlin. Yes, Berlin was now only a few kilometers away. On a clear April day, I had an amazing meeting. I left the army commander. A tall, dense colonel walked towards me with a broad, confident step. Is the general in? Abruptly, a little deaf bass, he asked the adjutant. The colonel's voice and face seemed familiar. Who is this? Where have we met? I thought, report to the commander that Colonel Proshin arrived to introduce himself on the occasion of his appointment as commander of the brigade. Asked the colonel. The adjutant put his hand to his cap and, turning dapperly, disappeared into the house. This is our former combat, Proshin. At once I remembered the 41st, the battles near Vyazma, and Captain Proshin, who was taken out alive on a tank from under fire. Ivan Ivanovich. I called him. The colonel turned round. No, don't you recognize him? Comrade Koshetkov? We shook hands firmly. Well, how are you? Nothing. I'm fighting a little. Proshin said modestly. I saw a wide scar crossing the colonel's left cheek. Vyazemsky mark. Proshin grinned, having noticed that I was looking at the scar. No, comrade commander is asking for you. The adjutant interrupted our conversation. The general is also an old acquaintance of mine. In the Finnish War, I commanded a platoon under his command. Zvoshin winked at me and hurriedly ran up to the porch. Looking round, he shouted, Well, we'll see each other again, Dmitry Ilyich. Later, Proshin and I met more than once. His tankers stormed Berlin, made a rapid march to Prague. In the historic battle for Berlin, our army took part from its very beginning, from the 16th of April, at 10 hours 30 minutes after a powerful artillery. Preparation advanced detachments rushed to the Spree River, and by the end of April 18, having knocked down the Nazis from the waterline stubbornly defended by them, tank formations with a landing force of machine gunners covered the area of Greater Berlin from the south in a wide arc. Part of the enemy troops were scattered in the forests, and tankers had to show high vigilance. Once, 3 kilometers from the town of Lyokno, where the battalion of guards Captain Muskin was located, 15 Nazi tanks suddenly appeared from the forest. Trying to mislead our guardsmen, Hitlerites raised red flags over the turrets. Nazi tanks were approaching as if they decided to pass by the village. But now their turrets turned round and the first salvos were heard. Captain Muskin's guards did not respond. They waited for the enemy to come closer. Having let the enemy get 300–400 meters closer, the captain ordered to open fire. Only 6 Nazi tanks managed to escape back into the forest. The rest were destroyed. They were still burning on the field in front of the village, and Muskin's battalion, curled up in a marching column, was already continuing the march. Here is a wide asphalt motorway. It turns steeply to the west. At the turn, a signpost with the inscription, "To Berlin 60 kilometers." In the midst of the battle for Berlin, I and several officers of the rear service on behalf of Major General Guliev went to the prisoner of war camp, which had just been occupied by our tankers. We learnt that the liberated prisoners of war were in a difficult situation as the camp had run out of food supplies. The camp was located 2 kilometers from the town of Luckenwalde. Our machine gunner was on duty at the gate. He pointed to a house not far from the entrance. That's where all their superiors are. We were met by an Englishman who called himself Richard Colliard. Not knowing English, I could not understand him. Fortunately, among the former prisoners of war was Lieutenant Andrew Wiseman, a navigator of the British Royal Air Force, who spoke Russian. "No, who is Colliard?" I asked him. "My compatriot, Lieutenant Colonel, commander of an aviation unit. He reported to you that this morning the Russian officer temporarily appointed him commandant of the camp." "Let me introduce you to everyone here," Wiseman suggested. "This is the Norwegian Major General Otto Ruge. This is the American Major Robert Martin. This is the British Colonel Collard, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull, Lieutenant Colonel Ingle. Where are all the camp authorities, headed by the commandant?" Oh, Herr Commandant und Oberst Treiter and his assistants hurried to get away." Wiseman grinned. "Your tankers were advancing so rapidly. They appeared in our camp in the morning. All Russian prisoners of war left the camp together with the tankers. We had about 2,000 Russians here." "How many prisoners of war are there in the camp?" "About 16,000 Englishmen, Americans, Frenchmen, Norwegians, Italians, Poles, Serbs." "No. Did the Russians live together with everyone else?" "No. A special camp was built for them inside our camp. The barracks where the Russians were housed, the Germans separated them from the rest with barbed wire. We were strictly forbidden to communicate with the Russians. Ask Mr. Colliard, since he was appointed commandant, what food supplies are available in the camp and what you particularly need." I asked Wiseman. Richard Colliard said that there was no food in the camp at all, and that this was perhaps the only pressing problem for them at the moment. Major White of the Intendant Service, who had come with me, estimated how much food should be delivered first and went to make the necessary arrangements. In a few hours bread, sugar, potatoes, cereals and meat were brought to the camp. Then we visited another camp where Russian prisoners of war were kept. It was already empty. Our attention was attracted by numerous inscriptions on the walls of the barracks. One of them I wrote down in my notebook. Here it is in full. Here was from September 1944 Markov Dmitry Ivanovich. On 11 April 1944 I escaped from Rittenberg Aircraft Factory. Was in the escape for 19 days. I was caught in Czechia, in the city of Moravska Ostrava, was in prisons in Brianov, Prague and Zagan. A native of the North Caucasus himself. I'd rather die, but I won't submit to the damned fascists. Somewhere now Dmitry Ivanovich. Markov is one of many thousands of ordinary Soviet people who experienced the horrors of fascist captivity, but did not kneel. Later we organized several trips to this camp. The agitators received vivid factual material for conversations with the personnel about the unbending steadfastness of Soviet people, about devotion to the... We returned to the army headquarters through the suburbs of Berlin. We had to travel a lot. The headquarters and the political department were on the march. Greater Berlin begins immediately after the Ring motorway, girdling the city. A wide strip of concrete motorway is divided in half by a green lawn. 3 cars can move in a row on each side of the motorway. On the right and left, one can see burnt Nazi tanks and cars, broken anti-aircraft guns, trench lines, scraps of barbed wire, countless craters from aerial bombs and shells. Familiar pictures, long lines of Germans, men and women, wandering along the motorway. They looked depressed and confused. In their eyes, fear, silent submission to fate. I met the head of the political department of the 63rd Guards Tank Brigade, Lieutenant Colonel M.A. Bogomolov. "Do you know who we liberated yesterday?" he asked. Adored Herriot, the former Prime Minister of France, and his wife. He said that he was arrested shortly after the occupation of France by Hitler's troops for not sharing Laval's views. In protest against the treasonous policy of the conciliators, Herriot removed the Legion of Honor and sent it to the new government. The Nazis first placed Herriot in a concentration camp near Paris, and then in one of the concentration camps near Berlin. For the last time, he was kept in the Berlin military hospital. As our troops approached Berlin, the SS came to the hospital to take Herriot to the western parts of Germany on Hitler's orders. The chief doctor and other hospital staff strongly opposed, citing the fact that Herriot was gravely ill. The SS backed down and left the old man alone. Herriot felt bad, but willingly talked with Bogomolov and the commander of the 63rd Tank Brigade, Lieutenant Colonel M.G.G. Fomichev. As a true Frenchman, he still found the strength to sparkle with wit, Bogomolov said. When we asked him if he would like to eat, he replied, "No, my wife likes tea and I like freedom." By the way, gentlemen, Herriot said to the Soviet officers, "You know, before the war I travelled to the Soviet Union. Some journalists wrote at the time that I was given the title of Cossack Colonel. No, how do you like that? What kind of military man am I? I don't understand anything about the military." Herriot stressed several times that he considered himself a long-time friend of the Soviet Union, that he was the first, back in 1923, to conclude a treaty with the USSR. On the night of 1 May 1945, when thousands of Soviet guns were still firing on the pockets of resistance in the Nazi capital, and the Scarlet Victory banner was already flying over the Reichstag, the battalion of the hero of the Soviet Union, Guards Captain M. Markov, came out of the Potspots. M. Markov left Potsdam and settled in the small town of Bielitz, not far from Berlin. A war scorched this formerly neat little town with its hot breath. Narrow streets were covered with broken glass and tiles from destroyed roofs, and the delicate green of the trees, dressed in festive spring attire, stood out strangely against the gloomy ruins. Captain Markov's soldiers had not had time to rest when it became known that a significant group of the enemy was moving towards Bielitz from the forests north of Cottbus. The captain ordered to take the defence. On Bielitz were enemy tanks and armoured personnel carriers with infantry. The fascists sought to break through to the west, and our soldiers stood in their way, an insurmountable wall. Hitlerites suffered heavy losses, but there were a lot of them, and they again and again made attacks. Guardsmen became more and more difficult to restrain the onslaught of the enemy. Too unequal were the forces. Captain Markov, with 12 machine gunners and 1 tank, fought off the fascists in the cemetery. Guardsmen fired, taking cover behind marble monuments and granite tombstones. When it seemed that Hitlerites could not be stopped, Captain Markov made a brave decision. Calling to himself the platoon commander, Lieutenant Kuznetsov, he ordered, "Get to ours in Bielitz. Gather everyone, repairmen, clerks, chauffeurs, cooks, and hit the enemy from the rear with them, but more energetically, with noise, with shouts of hurrah." Kuznetsov left. Markov and his men were running out of ammunition. Another counterattack was repulsed. The captain pulled out of his pistol clip. It was empty. There was only 1 cartridge left in the barrel channel. Will Kuznetsov succeed? And Kuznetsov was in time. In the rear of the enemy heard shouts of hurrah and grenade bursts. Hitlerites were confused. Thinking that a large reinforcement came, they began to raise their hands. More than 1,500 enemy soldiers and officers surrendered to a handful of Soviet brave guardsmen. Captain Markov wiped his sweaty forehead, grinned. "We celebrated the 1st of May not badly." The next day, Berlin capitulated. Columns of prisoners, escorted by our machine gunners, sluggishly dragged along the streets of the fascist capital. But the war was not over yet. Till the 3rd of May, our tankers cleared from the enemy the southern and southwestern outskirts of Berlin, participated in the battles for the cities of Potsdam and Brandenburg. In the morning of May 6, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front, having broken through another line of enemy defence, began to advance rapidly from the area northwest of Dresden to the Ore Mountains. Here, in the Ore Mountains, we learnt that the act of unconditional surrender of all the armed forces of Nazi Germany had been signed. While on most parts of the huge Soviet-German front the last shots rattled off, we had not yet received the order to put the covers on the tank guns. A large group of German fascist troops operating on the territory of Czechoslovakia refused to capitulate and continued to fight hard against our advancing armies. As the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia raised an armed uprising in Prague, the workers of the city entered into open, fierce struggle with the hated enemy. We heard the alarming calls for help broadcast by the Prague radio station. Prague has risen. Red Army soldiers help. Prague has risen. Prague has risen. And the Soviet soldiers hurried. Disregarding danger and fatigue sweeping away enemy barriers on the way, our tanks rushed to Prague. They were moving day and night. Berlin was far behind. The Sudeten mountains were overcome. In several tens of kilometers from the capital of Czechoslovakia, the advanced detachments came across the organized resistance of the enemy. Having slammed the hatches of the fighting vehicles for the last time, the tankers rushed into the attack. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of May, the tankers, tired and heated by the battle, entered the beautiful Prague. The commander of the lead tank, Guards Junior Lieutenant Mikhail Glazerin, threw back the heavy hatch cover and stuck out up to his waist. That's it. The end? Excited and joyful people ran out of the houses to meet the tankers. The cries did not stop. Nazdar. Atie Ruda Armada. In a few minutes Glazerin's tank was already drowned in flowers. Embarrassed by the hot meeting, the tankers did not have time to shake dozens of friendly outstretched hands. Out to the city centre the tanks moved slowly. Now and then their way was blocked by a jubilant crowd. Women in festive dresses hugged and kissed unshaven, tired tankers. Children with bouquets of flowers and flags were sitting on the armour of fighting vehicles together with machine gunners. Yes, the gratitude of the people was great. This touching, heart-stirring meeting will never be forgotten. I was travelling through Prague together with the commander. Nikolai Grigorievich slightly pushed me with his elbow and, turning his shining face to me, said, But the war is really over. Do you realize it, my father-in-law? Late in the evening I took out my shabby notebook, as I had done almost 4 years ago in the Belarusian forest, made a short entry, ending it with the words, Prague 9th May, and put a bold dot. On the ancient square darkened hulks of tanks, standing with open hatches. The tankers were resting, ready, if necessary, for new trials. Spring was in full swing.